We're here with Jodie Carey in her studio to talk about the work she's producing for a forthcoming exhibition at Idol Asante. Can you tell me a bit about the ideas behind the show and what you're creating for it?
I'm making a new body of works. The show's currently got a working title of Trees. When I was thinking about the show, I was thinking along the lines of a forest of sculptures. I'm very interested in ideas of ageing and memory, time passing, and that shadowy boundary between forgetting and remembering. And forests are quite primordial, elemental landscapes, and they speak about the passage of time. There's a kind of always a perpetual bond between past, present and future. In recent years in my practice, I've been really exploring a way of stripping back, so taking things away. Much of my earlier works used to be very decorative and ornamental. But I've really been working to strip things back, whether it's through form or colour or saturation, and relying solely on very simple, basic or processes to make objects. So whether it be carving, just pouring a huge block of plaster and just with a hammer and chisel carving something out, or weaving or drawing directly on the walls, and just using very basic materials, working materials like wood or timber or hessian to make objects. And these sculptures are made directly in the ground, so you literally just excavate a hole and you can cut out any shape you want and pour the plaster in. That process kind of developed to, I began burying objects and then removing them and then pouring the plaster in. And what happens is the plaster picks up the exact contours of the shape. It's a very rudimentary mould. It's kind of the most simplest way of casting. The actual cast bears all the traces of the land, so it picks up any stones or ceramic or glass or detritus that's in there. And these works are made by burying a length of salvaged wood. It's a very old piece of wood, 100 years plus. I very subtly worked into the wood slightly, just carving reliefs or taking bits of the wood away. But I kept it very minimal because I wanted them to have a kind of not to be heavily worked, to be quite subtle. Even if you didn't actually work the timber, the process of the casting means that every single cast would always be completely different because of how wet the soil was, or whether it had rained, or what exactly was on the surface before you poured the plaster.
Yeah, so the one behind you, for example, seems to have a lot more detritus on it than, say, the ones just in front of you.
Yeah. It's beyond your control, and it's a really nice way of making art. It's not precise and you don't have to be precious about the making, and it kind of gives you a freedom in that sense to be able to just to make without getting bogged down with making something perfect. And I like the fact that they're very physical objects and that they're a very handmade quality to them, and a material roughness.
Are you doing much to them once they've been moulded?
Yeah, they're just quite simple mark making, maybe a sweep of white paint and a little bit of colouring in with colouring pencils and paint, but again very subtly. When they're installed in the gallery, I want them to look like maybe just light's been reflected onto them, so they're just little patches of colour, like highlights, rather than completely coloured or spray painted or anything.
And you're making, is it 50?
Yeah, there's 50 of them. The number's kind of arbitrary. It was just about having an installation that the viewer would be able to walk into and be surrounded by these objects, and hopefully feel quite poetic as you're walking around them. I think it's surprising that the more you get of them, the more you notice the details, the differences between them when there's more of them.
So do you see each individual tree, if you like, as a work in its own right, or is it kind of the whole?
Yeah, they're individual works, but they're an installation of individual works. Yeah. My shows are always quite site responsive. I wouldn't say site specific, but I would say that I make work in response to the place in which it's going to be shown. I think for me that's the way you can make the best work, because you can work with ceiling height or natural lighting, architectural features. So these works are made with the gallery in mind. So it has a beautiful skylight where the light full comes down.
Which is like a clearing in a forest, maybe.
Yeah, a bit like clearing in a forest. And I think that, the surface of the sculpture is a bit like scarred, knotted tree trunks. And their scale is very important. I wanted them to be monumental, but still have a human scale, so they don't dwarf the viewer. And I think they could be trees, but they could also be human figures. So there's that kind of transition between human and nature.
You work with sort of these juxtapositions quite a lot in your work, so human, nature, life, death. Is that something that you're kind of consciously thinking about and trying to explore?
I like to juxtapose materials a lot. I like to make very large, heavy, physical sculptures, but at the same time I also like to show maybe embroidery or crochet or something a lot lighter. I really like a show that can kind of incorporate both those elements, both that way of working. It always amazes me when something that's quite materially slight can occupy space in the same way as a very large, heavy sculpture.
And your background is, well, you started off with textiles.
Yeah, I started at textiles at Goldsmiths, and then I quit, and then I reapplied and started again as fine art.
Was there something specific about that course that made you really want to be?
Yeah,
on
it was an amazing course at that time at Goldsmiths. I think they taught you to ask very fundamental questions of yourself as an artist, and I kind of still rely on that today, to be able to stand back and critique what it is you're doing. But then I also went to the Royal College of Art after that, and that's a very different way of working. That's very material and time in the studio based. And I think now my work is kind of is a middle ground, really. The concept of the work's still really important, but the actual, but I do tend to develop works through making, and one work always leads to the next, and I learn through everything that I make. But no, I don't have an idea that I execute anymore, because I think just through that process of making, maybe you can call it accidents or failures, the work changes and it invariably gets better for it, in my case. Making work for me isn't a job, it isn't like a 9 till 5, so it's kind of who I am, it's just an extension of who I am. So,
do you have a typical kind of studio routine? Because you had a slight hiatus because you had a baby 10 months ago.
Yes, I did. I never really stopped, to be honest. I was back in the studio 3 weeks after, and I think that's kind of the best way to do it, is to not stop, because I think it would be very hard to start again. But I can say that having children and making sculpture are entirely incompatible.
But yeah, I mean, you're managing to do it, so
yeah, I wouldn't change it for the world. But
what about the genre of still life? I mean, perhaps less so now, but definitely in your earlier work, how important was that as an influence?
I did look at still life, like vanitas, and that idea of huge bouquets of flowers that you thought of as life, as alive and beautiful, but actually the reality was the cut flowers were already dying. I'm very much more interested in this idea of the monument. For the past 5 years or so, I've been working to kind of challenge that idea of monuments being permanent and made from traditional bronze or stone or marble, and instead choosing to work with much more ephemeral, fragile materials, to maybe speak much more about our own mortality and the fragility of human life.
You've worked with bones, for example.
I've cast bones, but I've also worked with real bones.
With bone dust?
Yeah, I ground bones down to make a dust, and I took over one of the oldest academic buildings in Berlin. It's a most stunning anatomical veterinary theatre, so you got the round theatre, and then off of it you had 8 peripheral rooms, and I literally covered the whole of the floor space with this carpet of bone dust. And then depending on how the age or the type of the bone, you got beautiful changes in colour. So it was all white, but there was slightly more yellow or pink or even hues of blue like threading through, and there, again it had a kind of landscape feel to it. But when you first walked in, your immediate reaction was that it was completely empty, and it wasn't until you stopped and thought and you looked down that you realised that there was this huge monumental work right at your feet.
So is that important to you, to make people kind of stop and look at the detail within the large scale?
Yeah, I think I like my works to kind of be imbued with a silence and a stillness, and yeah, paying attention, just taking time to stop and to pause really. My work's still incredibly labour intensive, but in the old days it was so obvious. It had taken such a long time to craft the flowers or to cast 9,000 plaster bones and construct huge chandeliers. But now it's much more subtle, and it's not the first thing you think of when you look at the work, but maybe only on reflection when you think about how something's made. It's very important for me that these works do have this handmade quality, and that my shows feel like makers' shows, like a maker's show. I hope that by having that kind of material roughness, that they shouldn't do, but it makes people want to touch them, and kind of confirms that human need to touch or to hold or to make things.
It's not just mass-produced.
No, I do shy away from anything heavily fabricated. And I also really like to evidence how the work's been made, so it's ever there's no sort of trickery. So, you know, if there's wooden supports, the wooden supports are left visible. If you need sandbags to prop the work up, then the sandbags are there for you to see. Whereas normally monuments are in the round and they're beautifully finished, and they have these kind of hard, impenetrable surfaces, and you don't know how they were made.
Yeah. But what happens, for example, to the Berlin work that you just mentioned? Does it still exist in any form?
It exists in documentation, and the work can always be recreated in at different sites. But I think that's part of its beauty, that it was a monumental work, you know, it was, but you know, you could just breathe on it, and the dust was so fine, it would just disappear. So, and I think that's really nice that you have that juxtaposition of the monumental and yet the fragility and the transitory nature of just the material.
So even the monument is ephemeral in its own right.
Yeah. Yeah.